We're talking about forgiveness. For the next couple weeks, we're going to be talking about forgiveness. Really what I'm doing is making an argument. I want to make an argument. I want to argue a case. And the case is this: you've got to forgive. And last week we talked about the argument basically is what does it benefit you to hold on to grudges, to not forgive? There's no benefit at all. So that's the argument that we had last week, is that really forgiveness is for your benefit and also all your relationships. Now today, basically the argument is this: if you really believe and know that it is finished, then you're going to be much more inclined to forgive. But if you don't believe it's finished, then more than likely you're going to still hold on to stuff. So today I want just the overarching argument or theme or question for you to ask yourself as we move on today is it finished? Now, there's two kinds of things. Love keeps no record of wrongs. And so what we're going to be talking about today is debts and debtors. Okay? Now the first thing that we've got to understand is that all of us are owing God. We are owing God of something. I find that the more I realize how much I owe God for my sin, the easier it is for me to forgive others their sin. Jesus said this, which Shane read this morning. Thank you, Shane, for reading Matthew 6:12. The first part of that is, forgive us our debts. Debts. What's a debt? It's something you owe. A debt is something you incur. But ask yourself, when it comes to sins against God, what payment can you make? What can you give? Well, now with humans, you can write it off. When Joni and I were first married, and I made that sound like we've been married more than once. We just got married one time. But when at the early stages of our marriage, we had a child, and his name was Brooks, and we had that child in Whittier, California. And the hospital that we had the child at, we didn't really have that great of medical insurance and all that, and so we incurred quite a debt having a child. We tried to return him when we saw the debt. No, we didn't really think this through, and we couldn't do it, so we had to keep him. So Chad we had born in a field. Joni's tough. She's like one of them Hebrew women that were just bearing children out in the field there in Exodus chapter 1. But anyway, we incurred quite a debt. They found out we were youth pastors. Somebody did at the hospital. I think it was that there was like 40 youth that came on the Wednesday night that Brooks was born, and all said that they were family and brothers and sisters. And so anyway, the hospital wrote the debt off. They canceled our debt. Oh wow, what a blessing! That was just unbelievable what God did there. We don't know why, how, who, what. All we know is that we got a thing that said that our debt was canceled with the hospital. So debts can be written off, they can be paid off. As I said, they can be canceled. You can restructure a debt. Sometimes people just walk away from debt, right? I have people that owe me money. They just walked away from it. Nope, we're not going to pay it. Okay. What am I going to do? I could prosecute, but go to court and all that mess. Keep it. Just keep it. So you can do all that stuff. But when it comes to God, how is any of that going to work? You're just going to walk away from your debt with God? So here's the question. If God is a righteous judge, and he's the only judge, the true judge, righteous judge. If he's a righteous judge, he can't just sweep sin under the carpet. He can't just say, no big deal, right? Then he's not righteous. What would you think of a judge? If let's say you were robbed of $1,000 and you took somebody to court and it was proven that they were guilty and that they robbed you of $1,000, and the judge listened to the case and said, you're guilty, but no big deal. You don't have to pay anything or go any. How would you feel as the victim? Whoa, wait a minute. You're not a good judge. You're a bad judge. So if a judge is righteous, he has to pursue payment. So I owe God. I owe God this debt. I can't just walk away from it. It's not just going to be written off. God's a righteous judge. He's got to pursue payment. But we have nothing to satisfy the debt. Nothing. I have nothing to give. Does God need money? No. David says in Psalms 50 that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I mean, in heaven, John on the island of Patmos received a revelation. And when he received the revelation of heaven, one of the things he said about heaven is the streets were made of gold. Money's nothing to God. Diamonds, silver, gold, none of that stuff means a thing to him. He doesn't need anything. So you can't pay off your sins. Now, in the Middle Ages, you could. In the Middle Ages, you could go to a priest at the church and say, I was thinking about committing this sin. How much would it cost me? I was thinking about doing this, and the priest would look up and they'd say, well, it would cost you X amount of dollars that you have to give to the church, and then they would give you absolution. Go and do what because you paid it, you can go and sin. That's not going to work with God. That doesn't fly with him. There's nothing we have to satisfy the debt. So in God's pursuit of payment for our sin, our debt, my debt, he sent the only payment that would satisfy his need for justice, and that was himself. Now, most of you are saying, look, I know all this. I know all this. Okay, my question then is if you know all this, then you would have absolutely no problem with forgiving anyone. Right? If we truly know all this, then forgiveness would not be an issue. In fact, Jesus would never have to command us to forgive. If we truly knew this. See, and that's why I was saying, my argument today is, if you really believe it is finished for you and God, as far as your sin, and yet you're still holding unforgiveness, then we really don't understand what this means. Okay? You see, at the cross, God's justice met his love for you and I. But his need for justice, blood had to be shed, because that's the only payment, and God's the one that set the terms. But God can set the terms because God's the one who created everything. He wrote the software. God did. When he created everything, he wrote the software. The guy who creates it gets to write the software. It's his. And so God wrote the software. This is what is going to take for this, and this is what will happen for that. And so his justice met his love at the cross. And then his righteousness and God's need for righteousness met peace. You can read about that in Psalms chapter 85. David prophesied of what would happen when the Messiah would come. And so, because of all that, we don't owe him anymore. We owe God nothing. See, God made him who knew no sin whatsoever to be sin. Jesus literally became sin on the cross so that we might become the righteousness of God. It's the only way. So if I realize that I was owing God, and now I don't owe God, shouldn't it be much easier for me to forgive? Now, just a quick thing. I want you to see something at the cross. Two things. When he, being Jesus, received the drink, because Jesus said, I thirst. And so they brought him some vinegar, wine vinegar, and put it up to his lips. But when he had received the drink, Jesus said this, it's finished. It's finished. And then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. So two things I see. First of all, it's finished. All debts. So, if someone who robbed you of $1,000, let's go back to that analogy. Someone who robbed you $1,000, they're a thief. They stole. Jesus died for that on the cross. Someone committed murder. Horrible thing. The worst. Jesus died for that murder. And he died for that murderer. You see, when Jesus died on the cross, you had all the sins of humanity. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 3. The sins that were left us unpunished beforehand. So from Adam and Eve's sin, all the way back in the garden, all the way through Abraham's sin of lying, all the way through Moses' sin of murder, all the way through David's sin of lying and murder, and all the patriarchs' sin and everybody else's sin. All those sins were heaped up, so to speak. They were piled up. And then when Jesus went to the cross, all those sins were dumped on Jesus, and he became sin. But then all the sins that were going to be committed from humanity thereon, they were all taken and put on the cross. And so all debts were paid. And that's one of the definitions of it is finished from the Greek is telestion, is paid in full. Jesus, it's as if he said to God, paid in full. All the sins are paid. So whatever's happened to you and I by someone else or that we've done has already been paid. It's over. It is finished. And then with that, the second thing I wanted you to see is, so before God, all these debts are done. All of them. Every one of them. We understand that. See, this is my point again. If we understand this, then forgiving others should be easy because we realize that all their debts have already been paid by Jesus. He's already taken care of them. And he's taking care of ours. So he gave, then after he paid and after it was finished, Jesus gave up his spirits. And I thought of that and I thought, can I give up my vengeful spirit? In other words, Jesus paid it all and then let it go. And he gave up. There was no more need to fight. There was no more sacrifice needed. That's why he gave up his spirit. There was no more sacrifice needed. And so if I'm holding on to resentment towards somebody or I'm holding on to a grudge, then what I'm actually saying to God is there's still sacrifice that needs to be made. And in a sense, if you think about it, it's a slap in the face to Jesus to not forgive. Because we're saying we're holding somebody else to a different standard than what the righteous judge held them to. Jesus said it's finished. So as debts and debtors, we're owing God, but we have the opportunity of sowing good from here out because it's finished, because it's paid in full. You don't know what happened to me. You don't know what that person said to me. You don't know what that person did to me. No, I probably don't unless you tell me. But even then, Jesus said this. This is how you pray. Forgive us our debts as we also. 3 key words. As we also. I'm pretty sure everyone wants to be forgiven, right? Who wants to be held accountable for their sins? Anybody? Anybody want to pay for your own sins? Anybody wants to, not be forgiven? I think every one of us in this room wants to be forgiven. I know this for sure. I want to be forgiven. Okay. We all want a break. We want people to understand what we've been going through. Well, are we willing to do that for others? We all want to be forgiven. Are we willing to give forgiveness? See, that's the sowing part. We sow forgiveness because we're owing of God, but that's been completely paid in full. And so now, because the seed of forgiveness has been deposited in our heart, when we gave our heart to Jesus, the seed of forgiveness was put in our heart. And so now, because of that seed, we are blooming and bearing the fruits of forgiveness to others. That's the sowing. We're sowing forgiveness to others. Are we going to give people a break? Are we going to give people forgiveness, or will we hold on to their sin? In Jesus' prayer, he used this term, these 3 very important words, as we also. That's past tense, by the way. It's past tense. As we. Okay? It's done. In other words, Jesus shows that he expects, just from his prayer to the disciples and teaching us how to pray, is that Jesus expects you and I, because our debts have been forgiven, that you and I would forgive our debtors. It's an expectation. In fact, in Jesus' mind, it should be done. After all you've received, it is finished. It should be done. Who owes you? That's what a debt is. Really think about it for a second. Who really owes you? It only stands to reason. And this is the reasoning of Jesus from Matthew 6. That we would give what we've received. I've had to forgive a lot of people. I'm sure that you have as well. If you haven't forgiven a lot of people, you either have been very fortunate in life or you're not forgiving. Because there's a lot of things that happen to us in this world and in this day and age and in our lives. From parents to relatives to friends to bosses, employees, partners, marital partners, spouse, everything, children. We've been hurt a lot. We've been hurt a lot. But who really owes you, and why are you holding on to it? What do you expect to gain from it? If it is finished, if you believe it is finished, then letting it go should be natural. Just stands to reason. Forgive us our sins, Jesus says. 4, this is the reason we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And lead us not into temptation. You know what the temptation there is? Getting even on ourselves, getting payback, getting even. There's nothing that is going to change your heart other than forgiveness.